Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining APQC's March Human Capital Management Webinar, Part 2, Next Generation Shared Service Centers. A few housekeeping items before we get started today. This is a Q&A tool located on the right side of your screen. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them here and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and you will receive a copy of the slides as well as the recording via email in a few days. Our presenters today are Brad DeMint and Jared Crosby. Brad leads the Finance and Accounting Shared Services practice at ScottMadden and is also the leader of the Latin American Shared Services operations. With more than 15 years of domestic and international consulting experience, Brad brings extensive experience designing, improving, and merging shared services operations. Although his focus is on shared services strategy and implementation, Brad also has experience in building multifunctional shared service operations in Central and South America. Jared joined ScottMadden in 2003 and is a partner with the firm and has expertise in shared services design, implementation and improvement, project and change management, mergers and acquisitions, process improvement, and outsourcing. His industry experience includes utilities, entertainment, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, telecommunications, healthcare, and agricultural across a number of geographic areas, both domestic and international. And with that said, I will now turn the presentation over to Brad.
Yeah, thank you, Krista, for the introduction, and thank you very much for letting us use our high school photos. Those are actually very old photos. We've got a lot more gray hair now, especially Jared. But a big thanks to everyone who's joined. And good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. I'll tell you a little bit about what we've got in store today with this webinar. This is a condensed version of a much larger 3 or 4 hour workshop that Jared and I have conducted at other shared service related conferences. So we'll be hitting on some, it's meant to hit on some high level topics, some leading trends that we've noted over the years. We'll talk a little bit about what we've seen evolving in the current shared service environment. We'll make a little bit of a case for a transformational change. So, as consultants, we go into a lot of the stakeholders' offices and hear what's going right, what's going wrong, but you need to have some type of a burning platform to move on some of these principles that we'll be talking about, and then move through some guiding principles that cover some strategies in each one that may be new to you. They may be strategies you're already involved in or have even mastered. But we'll touch on those at a pretty high level and leave some time for questions at the end. Let's see, are you guys seeing the slides change? Okay, so a little bit, I won't spend too much talking about our firm, but just to give you a little bit of background and context, we are a 30-year-old firm with about 100 consultants, so we're a mid-sized group. We have 3 primary practice areas: energy, sustainability, and our shared service, our corporate and shared service practice area, which is where Jared and I are from. Within our firm, we have broken that corporate and shared service practice area into 4 primary functional areas, which you see on this page: finance and accounting, which is the group that I head; human resources, which is where Jared is. We also have an IT focus and a supply chain leader. What you're not seeing here too is possibly a 5th that we're seeing evolving, which is general services, which is really building maintenance, real estate, security, travel services, all of those cats and dogs that are very vendor driven in an organization, which we're also finding which are finding their way to shared service models, particularly multifunction shared service models, which we'll talk about later. Some of our client base, you can see the logos on there. I think the point here is that we've covered numerous industries. At this point, there aren't many industries we haven't worked in. We've designed or implemented over 200 shared service operations, which cover the regions of America, as Krista mentioned, a lot in Latin America, but also in Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, India, you name it, the region or the industry. We've found some type of a shared service design that fits all of these clients. So we've yet to find anyone in a region or industry that we can't tailor or customize a good shared service model to. So having said that, let's switch our focus a little bit to set the stage of the current environment. Some interesting statistics that we have seen in the past, and we'll credit the organization Horses for Sources with some of these data points. But at this point, as of last year, about 5,000 delivery organizations worldwide. So that's shared service operations, of which 3/4 remain captive, and the other 25% therefore being largely BPO operations. In a very interesting statistic, I thought, in 2004, about 10 years ago, a decade ago, only a quarter of global executives really saw the shared service model as strategic to their business. It was viewed largely as a very transactional organization built to save cost and standardize operations. Same survey taken a couple of years ago, now 90% are viewing shared service models as very strategic to meeting the corporate goals. At this point, maybe a surprising stat for those that are from the United States, but we're seeing more multi-functions globally than single-function operations, which may not be true domestically in the U.S., whereas we've got more mature operations that have grown up largely in single functions. But the clients we're working with that are building new shared service operations are almost all designing from multiple functions, meaning HR as well as finance, IT, supply chain, general services, reporting to one leader. Likewise, I'm here at a client site today with a very mature, large defense contractor that is step-by-step slowly merging mature single-function operations under one leader and into one combined delivery model. Smaller organizations getting involved. This is largely due to cloud-based technologies that used to require very expensive initial laydown of money. Now that the companies are able to rent these technologies, the business case is a lot easier to make. So a lot of smaller organizations getting into the shared service game. The primary driver shifting clearly. When we got into this business 15 years ago, designing and building shared service operations, most all clients were coming to us as a cost play. We need some way to standardize and reduce cost. And I would say that probably held true up until about 5 or 6 years ago. Nowadays it still seems that is a component of either improving or building new shared service operations, but we're seeing a much stronger emphasis on other drivers, such as flexibility, scalability, control in the organization, innovation in the organization. So we're seeing some very new drivers evolve out of this model. The global landscape is changing as well. It doesn't stand still, and this is an example of emerging markets. Probably 3 to 5 years ago, so not too long ago. We were seeing numerous shared service operations being developed in these low-cost regions. The red numbers indicate the number of shared service operations that exist there today, roughly. Now we're seeing a new change in those emerging markets. So we're seeing other regions, other countries starting to get into the game by offering, better economic incentives. They're getting, more skilled labor that suits the shared service needs. We're seeing areas in South America like Colombia and Chile becoming very shared service centric versus older areas like Costa Rica and Mexico, 3 to 5 years ago. We're seeing areas in Egypt, South Africa, Russia, even Southwest Asia, Vietnam, and Bangladesh, where these countries are intentionally focusing on the shared service market, the service industry. They're training and educating their youth to go to operations like this. They're offering incredible economic incentives to attract business. And so the point here is, we're often asked to help clients locate globally. Where's the best place to look for a site? If you were in that mode right now, the lesson we've learned is it's not about looking at today's data. It's about projecting where that data will be 5 to 7 years from now. because when we're locating, it's like buying a house. You don't want to buy a house and move out the next year. You're looking to at least plop down for 7 to 10 years. And so we'd encourage you to kind of look at some of these emerging markets. Overall, I think our message you'll see here today is that there has been an evolution here. So certainly we've evolved from the decentralized model 10, 15 years ago into a shared service model. Now we're seeing that transformation become more of an enterprise service delivery model. Some people call it global business services, but a more holistic look at all sites of a corporation around the globe. The issues that as a consulting firm, as a shared service consulting firm that we're wrestling with have shifted largely from, again, cost-related or savings-related issues, metrics, service level agreements, to broader issues like global governance, like hybrid outsourcing models. Where do we put regional country hubs? How do we build global process ownership into our model? So, very different questions that we're getting from our mature client base these days. So, a little more about the case for transformational change. One of the questions we ask our clients at very early stages of engagements is, what is your case for change? Why are you going after higher value-added functions or expanded geographies or end-to-end processes? And for a good defense to that answer, we encourage our clients to get out of the shared service operation, go talk to the executives of the corporation, figure out where the business units are going, look at their strategic plans, and make sure that the shared service operation plans align to those plans. If you can answer those questions in a way that supports the corporate or business unit strategic plans, you've got a much more defendable argument to launch on the initiatives that we're about to talk about today. So some of the feedback we're hearing from executives, stakeholders of shared service operations is that we go into their office and they say, look, we get this standardization thing. We've been doing it for 5 years, 10 years in some cases. We've kind of got that down. This is a complex organization. We need a little bit more flexibility in our model to the business units, which kind of flies in the face of the old philosophy of shared services. It's not about customization in the business units. It's about standardization and fitting the process. Well, now we're being asked, once we've kind of gotten over that hump and the business units understand shared service groups, is, can we infuse a little more flexibility into the operations? We're hearing it's not just about cost reduction, but now, with business intelligence tools and all of the data that's flowing through a shared service operation, can you do things to support profitable growth? Less about reducing the bottom line, more about increasing the top line, and how can a shared service operation help us there? In the second block, to further that point, they're asking for more focused subject matter expertise consulting, consultative services. And I think the message there is we've got the transactions. We're glad we've got them in one place. We're glad we've put some automation around them. But what can we do to add a little more value to the corporation or the business units from a consultative point of view that might be shareable between multiple business units? They're telling us complexity is increasing. Not that it wasn't complex before, but it continues to increase. We're launching into new markets, new geographies, new product lines. We're handling multiple acquisitions. We're servicing more decentralized business units, higher volumes. So how can a shared service operation support us in this new environment? The usual suspects of what's been going wrong are the same today as they were 10 years ago. We're seeing certainly organizations that are fragmented in their operations. Some business units use the shared service operations while other business units do it themselves or use an outsourced model, so very fragmented models. We're seeing unrationalized IT applications. So a very common problem, particularly when looking at scalability, is corporations that have numerous applications, some of which are very duplicate in nature. So when we grow, we're not changing 5 or 6 applications. We have to adjust 80 or 100 applications to enable that growth. We're seeing many mature operators that have just become very content in their transactional operations. They're still focused on moving the volumes and improving the transactional processes, which is not a bad thing, but we're encouraging them to kind of look up and see what other functions they might bring in, what other internal customers they may add to the shared service operations. So what we believe is required in very simplistic terms in these three buckets, which we'll talk more about, are really a transformation of shared services to multifunction or global business services, or both. We'll be looking at 5 principles that enable really a more holistic look at your corporation that will force you to break down silos, functional silos that are very common in most organizations, and look at more end-to-end process standards, management, governance, and more so to move into higher value-added services. So, to naturally keep a focus on the transactions and continue to improve, but to turn a little more focus to moving up the value chain, the ability to adapt to changes in the marketplace, use business intelligence to increase that top line, and maybe even develop an organizational model that provides more career path, improves the morale of the employees within the shared service operation. The tagline at the bottom is important. If you're not being asked by the business units to take on more services, and you're a mature operator that's been up, 5 years, 7 years more, I think it's worthy to take a step back and ask why. What is there something we're doing that hasn't caught the business unit's attention, that hasn't gained their trust to take on more higher value-added functions? And so let me go ahead and start talking about some of the guiding principles. I'm going to hand the baton over to Jared in a couple of slides, but I'll get us started here. What we found, we actually read an article that was a study conducted by MIT, whereby they went out and surveyed approximately 200 very small companies that had a very big brand name. In other words, if you'd have heard of these companies, you would think that they were 5,000, 10,000 employees, when in actuality they were 300 or 400 employees. They're servicing global markets, and so with that small group of staff, they're able to reach out and provide not only service but good service to customers in Europe and Africa and the Middle East and in Asia. And they had some common attributes, which are these 5 principles that we've structured some shared service strategies around, because it occurred to us a shared service operation is a lot like that. They called them, I believe, cosmopolitan companies. In other words, very small groups that were very broad-minded and culturally sensitive to the needs of customers outside of the United States. And so that's kind of where we see shared service operations going to in this global business environment is cosmopolitan-like shared service operations. And so we'll start talking a little bit about scale. Scale was certainly one of them. These companies that were successful, small companies successful in a global environment, had this in common, that they were all very scalable in nature, and not by accident. They designed to be able to take on very quickly new customer bases, new regions, new functions, new products and services. So we'll talk a little bit about stepping back, creating more of an enterprise service delivery entity, which could be expanding the functions. I believe we've largely got an HR audience on the webinar today, but we're seeing a lot of shared service operations, as I mentioned, become multifunctional. Rolling in finance, IT, supply chain services under one leader. We'll talk a little bit about consolidating geographic locations. And so, again, looking across the corporation or the enterprise, does it make sense to be organized the way we are today, if we built more so for a domestic service model? For time's sake, we won't spend a lot on technology, but that bottom block there is very important to scale. As I mentioned earlier, is taking a very focused look using your IT department at the applications that prohibit scale in your organization. And you probably all felt it if you've ever added a new customer base or gone through an acquisition, all the system work that has to be involved in that. Well, that system work can be enormous if you've got a lot of duplicate applications that have to be rebuilt or re-interfaced. They can certainly be smaller if you don't, if you've rationalized that down to a smaller group. So beginning with some discussion of multifunction, again, we're covering these at a very high level, and our contact information is in the back if you want to call us to drill down on any of these. But we've seen numerous definitions of multifunction shared services, and we've certainly walked into many clients who call themselves a multifunctional, but really have two leaders, one that leads finance and one that leads human resources or more. Then we've got introduced to their IT leader and their supply chain leader. We really believe a true multifunction, at least in the ScottMadden definition, has these functions combined. They don't necessarily have to be in one place, but they do need to report to one leader. They need to have one budget. There's one service management approach, typically common service customer satisfaction results across all of the functions, because it's one philosophy of shared service operations. And so why are our clients or why are companies doing this? They're really recognizing the scale of the elimination of duplicate efforts that can happen here. They're seeing multiple call centers. If you've got an employee service center and you've got a financial shared service call center and you've got an IT help desk, they're all using the same types of technologies. Some of the skill sets are even very similar. There can be some cross-training opportunity there. There's sharing of just simple facilities, sharing of infrastructure, IT infrastructure. It certainly is a model that facilitates, we'll be talking a little later about end-to-end processes. Well, if processes cross across HR into finance or into IT or general services and they report to one leader, it tends to be a lot easier to start aligning those in an end-to-end fashion. There's also an opportunity to combine support functions to a shared service operation. So single shared service operations often have somebody that's looking at, across the organization for continuous improvement opportunities, an internal project management group or an internal group that does business intelligence or just compiles the performance metrics, or an internal group that trains staff or develops staff. Well, if you've got a multifunction, those types of support groups to a shared service operation need not only look at one single function, they can look across all of these functions and do the same thing in a much more scalable fashion. So, an example of a shared service, multifunction shared service organization structure is on this page. And we won't pretend that this is the only structure. We've seen, there's hundreds of ways that you can organize a multifunction shared service operation, but some of the common components that we see as leading practice are dedicating, some group to high volume customer care issues. And so you see the examples there that you might have, IT help desk, AP exceptions, employee HR service center activities, all reporting to one customer care center. That doesn't mean you don't have different representatives handling those types of questions, but it does mean that you share the same type of infrastructure, and it does mean that there's some sharing opportunities, some cross-training opportunity potentially available there. Distributed account managers, so managers that can get out into the regions, particularly if you're covering more territories outside of the United States, to provide a face to the customer, someone that can bring back issues to the shared service operation. Jared will talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. And, in this type of model, you've got someone that's focused on client service. In many or single function operations, we ask, where is your client service component? I don't see it in your org chart. Well, there's a much larger opportunity to take that out of each of the individual functions in the multifunction and put one person in charge of client service, whether it's high volume services in a call center environment or lower volume of account management with the business units. We're seeing a better opportunity for business intelligence. So you don't only have HR data flowing through the veins of the shared service operation, you've got financial data, you've got IT data, you've got general service data, all that can be harnessed and possibly correlated to go back and address that need that the stakeholders are asking for. Increase my top line. You've already decreased my bottom line and saved the cost, but what information can you give me that might lead to a better product or a better market that I can pursue, closer to the corporate objectives? One visionary, so one leader that does kind of lay the path, set the groundwork, set the philosophy for all of these functions with a shared service model. We see many companies, same company, but very different approaches to single function shared service operations that may be located all around the U.S. or all around the world because they have multiple leaders that have different beliefs. Well, in a multifunction, you can align that philosophy. Going backwards, hold on. There is a place for what we call centers of expertise. You've heard of these, or some call them centers of excellence, but higher value-added services, Tier 2, Tier 3 type services in the multifunction. But more so, as I mentioned earlier, an opportunity to start looking at end-to-end processes that may cross over some of these functional silos like finance, human resources, supply chain, to build purchase-to-pay or hire-to-retire type processes in the organization. Much easier to do that in a multifunction. So these are some of the reasons that we're seeing either newcomers to the shared service operation designed from the beginning this way, or mature operations like the one I'm sitting in today, evolving very mature single-function siloed shared service operations into a multifunction environment. A little bit of a discussion about global business services or enterprise business services. It's another scale strategy, and it's certainly something, if you've been to any of the conferences lately, this is a primary topic. We're hearing a lot of discussion about looking across the entire enterprise. So servicing, offices in Latin America and Asia and Middle East with one shared service model, potentially one global business service leader. So, it's basically about kind of erasing the borders. If you erased all of the borders, the country borders, would you be designed the way you are today? You might build a different model. And then factoring in the things you have to factor in, language, familiarity with country laws, culture, time zones, currencies, taxes, and how would you modify that model to accommodate that? I guarantee you'll come up with a very different model than you have in a domestic shared service operational model. And so, the way we approach this with clients is really it's the same tiered approach that we look at a beginning, single function shared service operation is, transactional activities are more centralizable, if that's a word, able to, push things into a system from one place. Doesn't necessarily mean it should be in one place. We encourage companies to think about redundancy issues, maybe even follow the sun type benefits that you can get from handing transactions from the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere and processing 24 hours a day. But a lot of opportunities to be gained here. You see these regional green blocks are areas where you kind of move up that tiered pyramid into Tier 2 type services where you're problem solving or analyzing issues, which often require you to deal face-to-face or over a phone with customers. Well, those are reasons to leave some contingency in the countries or in the regions. Centers of excellence, you can see they can be anywhere, and Jared will talk a little bit more about those. But what we're seeing is virtual centers of excellence where you may have expertise around the globe. There's no reason to break that down just to put it in one place. There's a way to keep that center of excellence and connect it virtually. This is just another model that you might consider. We call it the super center model. For those of you familiar with Procter & Gamble, Procter & Gamble has a similar model to this where they don't disconnect the transactions from the problem solving or the customer facing issues. It's intentional. It gives them a little bit of duplication or backup in the event of a natural disaster or an IT disaster. They can move data from one region to another. It gives them follow the sun capability, but it also doesn't break the process between doing the transactions and solving a problem if you have a problem within those transactions. So everything's okay until something doesn't go into the system or there's a problem, and this gets them out of the business of having to call across the globe to try to solve that problem from a single global transactional hub. We thought we'd include a real model. This is one of our clients that gave us permission to show their model. This is R.R. Donnelley, the world's largest printing operation. And, you know, if you've been to any of the shared service conferences lately, you'll see that literally 4 out of every 5 of the presentations of mature operators start their presentation with a map like this. You know, these are our hubs. They use a different type of language. You know, these are our customer-facing hubs. These are our transaction centers. They've all put some thought into either building new operations in low-cost areas or leveraging existing sites in beneficial areas to distribute to plan out the transactions, to plan out the customer-facing activities. And, you know, in this case, this particular case, our client will tell you that the biggest value they've gotten is that 24-hour around-the-clock processing. They don't have to hire agents in one place to work night shifts. They pass information from the U.S. and Latin America to India every night and resolve issues with that information the next morning in the United States and Latin America. Let me pause. We've got the opportunity to do a little survey. So we're going to ask Krista to tee this up, but just so we get a gauge of the audience that's on, I think we've got numerous participants signed up. Tell us very quickly what model you currently fit in to give us just a little bit of a histogram of the model you're operating in. We're curious, and it might help gauge the audience. So take about 5 seconds here and quickly click the model that you're operating in, and we'll show you the results in just a moment. While we're doing that, again, we'll mention this is, you know, we're hitting these topics at a very high level. We realize that. Please feel free to get in touch with us after the webinar, Jared or myself, to go a little deeper into these issues if you like. So you see the results here clearly. Most surprisingly, still very single-function domestic operations, some multifunction, a very small percentage of early and mature global multifunction operators. So clearly, you know, room to grow from the single-function providers, the multifunction that are just domestic. You know, back up and kind of ask yourself, if you have operations outside of the United States, does it make sense to try to expand the delivery model? It doesn't mean necessarily try to service everyone from the United States, but to expand some hubs and spoke type model components to provide good service in a similar model to other regions of the world. So I'll keep moving along here. The second principle we'll talk about is a process focus. This is another common attribute that the MIT found very common in these cosmopolitan companies, is they all had a very heavy focus on process. They were continuously improving. They had a laser-like focus on standardizing processes. They looked at their processes in an end-to-end fashion. They created some type of governance around those processes. In other words, if I want to change a process and, you know, and I need permission, how do I do it? You know, who's the tiebreaker? They also had some form or component of continuous improvement in their organization. They're very innovative, and Jared will talk a little bit more about innovation in a moment. But these are some attributes we think you can apply to a shared service operation as well. You've probably all heard end-to-end processes. You're probably most familiar with the ones on the top row there, you know, hire to retire and HR environments and financial and supply chain environments, procure to pay, order to cash. You know, we encourage you, if you've already implemented those types of processes or governance around those types of end-to-end processes, take a look up the value chain, you know, some of these other areas that you see below, you know, budget to reporting, prospect to order, market to prospect, you know, service to satisfaction. These are processes that you can kind of back up, take a look at, map them out, put an owner over them, give somebody some authority to change them, and focus on them, you know, not only domestically, but, you know, we see a lot of strength in global process owners pressing those across multiple regions, and certainly by nature they move across multiple functions. Some of the process ownership responsibilities, there's also process councils that we've seen, but we run into them all the time at these conferences in different regions of the world. The same person that works for one company that's responsible for hire to retire or order to cash, and they're running to Romania. I see them in Brazil. They're out in Asia asking the same questions. What are your leading technologies? How can I standardize? More important, where can I not standardize? What are the country-specific regulations or laws that won't allow me to standardize? What are some common metrics I can put in place here? How do I manage the policies? How do I define and manage the master data that supports these policies and processes? And so you can see the power of putting one very strong owner over an end-to-end process and, again, focusing like a laser beam on these types of issues to really drive more economies in the processes. Any of you who have been down this path, especially if you've moved outside of the United States or covered more than one country, you'll show up, and I guarantee you hear the same thing that we hear is you can't change this process because there's a law here that states that we have to do X, Y, and Z. And that may very well be true, but I can tell you 3 out of 5 times, if you peel the onion back a little bit more, you'll find that, yeah, there may be a law, but that's not exactly what it says, and it does allow some flexibility. And so really the point of this slide is do that, kind of scratch beyond the surface there. We often use local economic investment agencies. We use clients in those regions to explain the way that they standardize or where they have to customize to get kind of a third-party perspective on this. But don't stop there. It's the message is most of the time we found out that when we hear that initial resistance or throw down that there is a law that prohibits you to do that, that's not the full story, even though sometimes it is. And we've also found that for that bottom gray area there that many of companies they mistake an old policy that's just been around for 10 years, 15 years as law, just because they've always done it. It was there when they arrived at the company. It's always been there, and they think that's a local law, and sometimes that's mistaken for something that can be changed or challenged. And so with that, I'm going to turn the baton over to Jared, and he's going to pick up with the third guiding principle.
All right, Brad, thank you very much. I've learned a lot already. a lot of good information. Yeah, this category, the third, is business responsiveness and flexibility as well. So some of the key strategies here, we're going to focus on 2. First being business relationship management. So business relationship management provides a well-defined point of contact to support positive interactions between the shared service organization and the business. Includes things like discussions on service offerings, changes to the business unit needs, working on joint objectives and initiatives. Really making sure that you have someone directly speaking between the shared service organization and the business. A relationship manager needs to consider both the enterprise service delivery perspectives and the needs of those business units, and maintain alignment between the 2. The second area that we'll discuss is really to recognize that one size does not fit all. And there's opportunity in a mature shared service organization to adopt a strategy for smaller and unique business needs. Brad talked earlier about the push for, we've done standardization, what more can we do? And this speaks to that. So we just described that sometimes one size does not fit all for our customer organizations. An example of a unique need is on the global level is non-U.S. countries, right, who bring additional complexity because of language barriers, political challenges, cultural differences, and sometimes technology barriers from the systems that we are currently using. So what can we do? Well, the business relationship manager role is an option and a technique that can be used. It's responsive. It puts someone in place to help navigate service challenges and ensure there's good communication between the 2 organizations. There are multiple ways to approach this, though. As you see on the map, each of the areas or countries is unique and has different challenges. So one option is to go a little more light and have an ambassador role, potentially part-time, which basically is there to convey messages between the two organizations. Someone to bring back from the countries that, hey, morale's just not very good right now, or the work day's different lately, so we need to modify our expectations. And also someone to deliver messages to the countries in your customer businesses that maybe we need to implement this new process and we need to do it right away. We need your help. Someone to basically facilitate. Another avenue is to go with a manager role, likely full-time. It's a lot more formal. It'll have direct influence on back office operations, oversight on service quality, and often dotted line reporting to the region or country to make sure there's a really strong connection there. Let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about unique businesses. So smaller business units need to get their services somewhere, but they may have trouble fitting into our standard shared services delivery model. Some of the characteristics of these could be, incubator business that needs to focus heavily on their core business. They're getting up and running. They may be challenged with heavy pressure to increase the top line, and they're not really interested in getting the back office part perfect. They may also have employees who are wearing multiple hats and just trying to keep up with the back office administration and corporate functional activities, and they may not be corporate function professionals. So these organizations often will have little influence on the services that they get from the shared service organization just because of their size. So what can we do in this case? Well, one example is an incubator business arm. So this is, Brad talked about flexibility and getting out of our standard approach. This is an example. So this could be a shared service organization. It's an offshoot from the core operations group with a mission to provide standard and non-standard services as needed by these smaller clients. In this example, you see a unique leader as well as unique service areas from the customer retention, data processing, the functional work itself in HR and benefits, and even their own IT application and support. So this approach can also help be a development ground for the shared service organization itself. You can incubate best practices here, try some things out, look for flexibility, and it can serve as a development ground for employees from the overall shared service operations to gain new capabilities and skills. So there's a couple of benefits to looking at it from this perspective. I also want to take a second and talk about the fact that even your common businesses may react differently to your services, because each is in fact unique in some way. So you need to keep a pulse on the favorability of the services, your services that they're receiving. So for this reason, ScottMadden long ago developed a shared services customer satisfaction tool, and it helps identify opportunities to improve service by each customer segment. Now that's responsiveness. That's what we're talking about. Measuring in this or similar ways can give you information you need to truly assess and be responsive to your business. So if you aren't measuring, if you aren't getting to your customer segments and looking at them uniquely, you do need to go further. This is what people are trying to do now. So let's have a look at innovation, the fourth area. So two strategies that we'll talk about today. Centers of Excellence, Brad mentioned. They can improve responsiveness and agility for corporate services. They bring high levels of expertise, and by putting them together, you give greater accessibility to this expertise to more business units. It's also great for scaling and specialization, and it improves affordability of the expertise across the organization. Some Centers of Excellence characteristics include they can be a source for innovation, and that's what we're talking about. Bringing people together centrally, having them collaborate can be a real avenue to get results. They've generally been brought together centrally, but as Brad mentioned, virtual options are definitely coming into place. The second category is business analytics. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. So Centers of Excellence. We've got an HR example for everyone on the call today. The point I want to make here is it's a way to collaborate. So you bring expertise together, as we just talked about. You can do it virtually. But then the Center of Expertise collaborates with HR business partners and shared service organization managers. And what they do is they solve escalated service issues. They gather information from the operations for policy and program design, to name just a couple things. I think it's fair to say we've definitely seen tremendous benefit in organizations where the reporting structure is clear, the organization is well defined, and the goals are known by those that need to collaborate. And it does produce great benefits to the company and innovation. So this is an example of virtual problem solving that Brad mentioned, so I won't spend much more time on it. But the point is, centers of expertise and excellence at one point in time, we really thought they needed to be together because you could answer things faster, collaborate because you're in the central location. But virtual technology and the ability to solve problems virtually is certainly a new way, something that if you can implement the technology, something that you can achieve. So let's talk about analytics for a second. This is the second strategy in innovation. So where measures and metrics provide basic snapshots, analytics leverages data for content-specific insight that is actionable. So I'll give you a quick example. A metric could be employee satisfaction, including the employee's perception of communication, teamwork, their managers, whereas identifying a correlation between management decisions and employee satisfaction would be something that's analytical. So it provides some insight and gives you things that can be actionable. And why is this important? Well, I think senior leadership needs to understand the value of human assets and how they can impact those assets. I think it also puts HR in a much more proactive position rather than being reactive, because it gives them forward-looking information and actions that they can take. This slide at a very high level to show that the data resides in shared service organizations, and often you need data from different groups to be able to assess and perform some analysis to find the trends and forward-looking information that you want. If you look at the human resources box, you're familiar with many of these things: working patterns, hiring trends, reasons for leaves. All of these are telling you things about your organization and should be able to produce actionable results. That is a value opportunity. And that's the key point of this slide. So here's a quick example. This one demonstrates a study that an organization used. They used information to provide insights and understanding about some key demographic gaps that they had, which were probably not going to bode well for them in the future or for reporting concerns like EEOC. As well, it identified for them their risk from retirement and what that may have on their operations. So it gave them insights and allowed them to plan ahead and change their talent acquisition strategies because of it, and talent management talent management activities. So where do we stand? For all the talk of analytics and analytic tools in the marketplace, I think things have really moved from, and we've seen with our clients, people moving from a novice to the bell curve moving more towards experienced. And what this is there's more collaboration across teams. There's more analysis than just looking at historical information. There's forecasting that is starting. So there's enormous potential for value here. And if you haven't started to do this, you may want to start before someone else in the organization is tapped to use and look at your analytical information. The last category. I'm trying to make sure we stay on time for everybody here. So this is the coordination. Facilitating coordination is very key. We're just going to talk about two. There are many coordination strategies, but we'll talk about two today. The first is to manage business expectations through more informal reporting. And I'll talk about that in more detail on the next page. And then to simplify your cost structuring, giving people something that they can understand. So if we look here at SLAs, I mean, the point of this slide and the message, the trend that we've seen is that things have been evolving. There was a time, and in some organizations it may still be needed, but there was detailed, lengthy, and formal service level agreements developed. But what you see over time as the relationship between the shared service organization and the business units evolves and the shared service organization stabilizes and improves, that the effort and time spent on a detailed SLA just doesn't appear to provide the value that it once thought that it might, certainly once the operations have matured. So what you see is things moving to a less formal structure, maybe agreement on key metrics and some reporting around those, and then some exception-based reporting around shortfalls or status on business issues, leading all the way to a lot more informal SLAs. And I'd work with several clients that even from the first few days of operations really set the SLAs aside and have operated for more than a decade with very, very informal SLAs. It's more of a partnership. There's cost awareness, there's value awareness, and any issues or concerns are addressed on the formal and ad hoc basis. If you go to a shared service, an outsourcing seminar, you hear the outsourcing organizations talk about partnership and not wanting to focus on the SLA. It's a lot of administrative work, and organizations that have shown their ability to perform and have good relationships are able to move away from that formality. The final one, and then I'll hand it back to Brad quickly, is chargebacks. And the point here is that, you need to keep it simple. We need transparency, and simplicity brings transparency. Allows for transparency. You need to understand what the cost drivers are. If it gets too complex, it's very difficult to understand how the behaviors will influence overall delivery cost. Some basic productive chargebacks we have listed there. Transactions in finance. That's simple, but it works. Payroll, paychecks. For HR, number of employees. We've also seen very counterproductive trends, and I want to share those, is that in simplest terms, that the benefits of billing and enforcing penalties on business units tend to outweigh any productive activities that you may get from it. So it becomes non-productive and really tarnishes the relationship focusing on these. For many clients, it's something that we've experienced. So that completes talking about coordination in our fifth category. I'm going to hand it back to Brad to do a quick summary, and I think we'll have a few minutes to wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just wrap quickly, but allow time for a few questions, but saying that, I think the message that we're hearing overall, and based on the survey results that we just took, of those of you that are single-function domestic or multi-function domestic operators, is you likely had to get there by being very rigid, by being tough, by enforcing standards, maybe even penalizing in service level agreements. What we're seeing the more mature audience doing is assuming that you've gotten over that hump where customers now kind of get it, after 5 or 6 years in operation, is some laxing, some easing off of that rigidity in the model, a little bit more allowance of some customization if it makes sense, of getting outside of not necessarily so much centralization, but maybe considering some hubs in other parts of the region that could still be managed centrally. And so, I think the message here is we've hit a lot of different topics. We're not necessarily saying rush out and do all of this at once. In fact, we would say don't rush out and do all of this at once. Clearly, a business case needs to be made for each of these. Everyone on this call has a company that's in a different environment. So, you may be in an environment where it just doesn't make sense to develop a global business service. If you don't have much volume in Asia, why enforce a shared service model on Asia? And so, build the case, think it through, but have a vision. Is there a way I can advance to the very last slide?
I got it, Brad. There you go.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. And, this is just an example, but, again, that's the message is have a vision in mind. You may be back at step 1. Step 5 may be 5 years from now of having a multifunction global operation if that is in the cards for you. But, take it step by step, build the business case, put some plans around it. The hardest part is going to be gaining sponsorship, breaking down the corporate barriers between country organizations and doing that, and that'll take some time. But we hope this has been helpful for you. I'm going to conclude now and say thank you. I think we've got a little bit of time for some questions. I'll turn it back over to Krista to facilitate that if there are any.
Sure. We had a thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please submit them in that Q&A tool. We did have a few that came in during the presentation. The first is, what are the benefits to HR for being part of a multifunction service center? Are there any downsides?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm really seeing this week is we're working in a very large HR shared service operation that has a very large financial shared service center across the street. And so the first thing we're looking at, it's kind of the bottom of that pyramid, is that's where you'll find, you know, the heavy work, where the volume is, that requires processes, that requires supporting technology, which is often the transactions or the daily customer calls, the problems that come up, is there's an opportunity to share that infrastructure. And it may not be finance, it may be IT, but chances are your company's got an IT help desk. They have a case manager. They have automatic call distribution systems. They have knowledge-based systems. You know, and in the event that this is duplicate in nature, that there's an opportunity to share that and kind of use a common platform for problem solving and handling customer issues. Likewise, there's transactions that are very common. You know, just raw putting data into a system, employee records. You know, that type of information that type of activity is very common in supply chain. It's very common in finance, that we're just taking information, maybe time data for payroll, maybe accounts payable invoice data into the GL, even accounting journal entries into a GL. Well, it may sound like it's a whole different world, but the reality is a very similar skill set can do all of that, and we've seen that. And with just a little bit of cross-training, there's potentially some synergies to leverage your HR transactional people and your HR employee service center across other functions. The downside, very quickly, you know, it's a multifunction. Clearly, you know, the head of HR shared service center is no longer the head of the multifunction shared service center unless they are promoted. And so often just struggling with the leadership issues of, you know, I used to be the full person in charge of one function, and now there's a person above me in charge of all functions, can be very difficult. And reporting of the multifunction. You know, I used to report to the senior vice president of HR in the corporate office. Well, that didn't make a whole lot of sense anymore. If you also handle financial functions or supply chain functions, we see a multifunction as reporting more to a chief operating officer or even the president of the of the company.
All right, great. Well, we did have a few more questions, and I will just email those to you after the call just for time's sake. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Alyssa Tucker, who's our HR Research Program Manager here at APQC, and she'll kind of quickly go through a few closing thoughts, and then I'll go ahead and end the call here in a few minutes.
Wonderful. I just would like to extend a big thank you to Brad DeMette and Jared Crosby of ScottMadden for sharing their expertise today on next generation HR shared services. And I would like to point out for our listeners that in a few days they will receive a copy of the slide deck from today's presentation. And at the end of the slide deck, you will see some APQC resources that you may use to help you take action upon the information that you learned here today. What you're seeing up on the screen right now is some of our resources on process optimization. We talked a lot today, I believe it was Brad, on about end-to-end processes, and APQC has a wealth of knowledge, including a specific process classification framework for human resources. So you'll want to check that out. And then if we could go to the next slide. We talked today, Jared talked about guiding principle number 4, fostering innovation through centers of excellence and business analytics. And we have a lot of research that we've recently completed on the future of HR, which talks about the specific HR competencies that are required to be a center of excellence to perform business analytics. So I encourage you to check those out. And then our last slide, if you could advance the slide, Krista, we have some upcoming research studies at APQC that will look at some of these issues in depth in the next year. One is case studies that we're conducting on strategic HR partnerships, what that looks like. We have a study coming up this year on HR process improvement, and also a study on HR measurements and analytics. And there are links on this slide that you can click to learn more about these studies, and also to sign up to receive information on them as they progress. So I will turn it over to Krista to conclude the call.
Great. And thank you so much, Brad and Jared, again. It was such a great webinar, and I know our listeners really enjoyed it. We got some good feedback. And I just also want to thank everyone for attending today. And with that, we're going to go ahead and end the call. And I hope everyone has a great day. And thank you again for your time, everyone. Really appreciate it. Thank you.